In the chaos of World War II, one of the most insidious forms of control wasn't just on the battlefield, it was in the very rhythm of people's lives. The state, especially under totalitarian regimes, didn't just demand loyalty, it demanded time. Every hour of every day was accounted for, measured, and directed. Citizens weren't simply asked to serve, they were scheduled, organized, and, in many ways, owned. From the moment they woke up to the moment they went to sleep, their time was no longer their own. Factories dictated their shifts down to the minute, ration lines consumed their mornings, and mandatory meetings or drills filled the rest. The concept of leisure, of unscheduled personal moments, became almost unimaginable. Time itself, something we usually take for granted, was weaponized, turned into a tool of obedience. This control extended far beyond work. Schools were designed to indoctrinate, teaching children not just facts but a strict obedience to the state's ideology. Even recreation was co-opted, sports, parades, and public ceremonies were orchestrated to reinforce loyalty. Every activity, every interaction, became a means to shape the citizen into a perfectly functioning cog within a larger machine. Personal choice was stripped away, not with overt violence in every moment, but through an unrelenting, omnipresent pressure to conform. People were so absorbed in fulfilling the state's demands that the very sense of having a life outside of service to the regime almost disappeared. In many ways, the state's ownership of time was more profound than even the control of movement or speech. While propaganda could manipulate opinion and force could punish disobedience, controlling how someone spent their hours, and by extension, their days, weeks, and years, eroded the foundation of personal freedom. Life became a series of tasks to be completed, a rigidly constructed schedule designed not for the individual's benefit but to maximize the state's goals. There was little room to pause, to reflect, or to resist. Every day was structured in such a way that compliance became automatic, almost mechanical. The effects of this control went beyond mere inconvenience. Psychologically, it was draining, even dehumanizing. Humans are wired to need autonomy, to make choices about how we spend our time, and when that is stripped away, it creates a constant, underlying tension. People became exhausted not only from labor but from the mental strain of existing in a system that allowed no personal rhythm. Even simple acts, like choosing when to rest or when to eat, were often dictated by the state, reinforcing a sense of perpetual subordination. It was a quiet, relentless oppression, less visible than tanks or guns, but equally powerful in shaping lives. And yet, within this rigid structure, the human spirit found cracks to peek through. Even when the state claimed ownership of every hour, people discovered subtle ways to reclaim fragments of time for themselves. It could be as small as sharing a forbidden conversation in the back of a factory line, or reading a smuggled book late at night. These moments might seem insignificant in the grand scope of history, but they represented a refusal to surrender completely, a reminder that while the state could control schedules and labor, it could not entirely conquer personal experience. By taking control of time, the state essentially sought to erase the boundary between individual and machine. People weren't just workers or soldiers, they were living instruments of policy, their lives measured and optimized for the goals of war and ideology. The tragedy of this control lies in how subtle it often was. Unlike overt violence, which is visible and shocking, the domination of time seeps in quietly, shaping thoughts, limiting possibilities, and bending people toward compliance without them always noticing. Understanding this dynamic is crucial because it frames the other struggles of the era. The stories of resistance, courage, and even survival are not just about defying orders, they are about reclaiming something profoundly human, the ability to make choices about one's own life, even if only in small ways. When the state owns your time, every act of personal agency becomes a radical statement. And it's precisely in this tension, between the rigid schedule imposed from above and the fleeting, stolen moments of autonomy, that the drama of World War II civilian life truly unfolds. Even in the darkest corners of World War II, when the state seemed to own every second of daily life, there were individuals who refused to surrender completely. While the machinery of totalitarian regimes sought to crush autonomy, people found ways to assert control over their own bodies, their own choices, and their own acts of defiance. It was a quieter form of resistance, often invisible to the authorities, yet it carried immense power. The state could command your time, your labor, your attendance at rallies, but it could not always dictate the private decisions you made with your own body. And in those decisions, small though they might appear, lay a spark of freedom that no regime could fully extinguish. Some of the most striking examples came from ordinary people who performed extraordinary acts of courage in their daily lives. For instance, workers in factories or on farms, whose every hour was accounted for by the state, found subtle ways to slow the machinery, misplace tools, or delay production without being caught. To the state, these might have seemed like minor disruptions, but to the individuals involved, they were a way of reclaiming agency, of asserting that even under strict oversight, they could choose how their own hands moved, how their own bodies worked. In that moment, they were no longer mere cogs in the system, they were human beings asserting ownership of their own physical presence. Then there were the acts that required even greater courage, the ones that risked life itself. People hid food for the starving, shared forbidden literature, or carried messages for resistance movements. Each of these acts was more than survival, it was a declaration that, despite the state's claim to total authority, personal choice still existed. Even in the face of severe punishment, people chose how their bodies would move, where their attention would go, and what risks they were willing to take. This ownership of the body became a battleground in its own right, a space where freedom could be exercised even when time and routine were completely controlled. What's remarkable is how this form of resistance often relied on creativity, cunning, and a deep understanding of the systems people were forced to navigate. In concentration camps or occupied cities, prisoners and citizens alike developed secret signals, hidden spaces, and covert routines. A hidden note, a swapped ration, or a moment of silent prayer might appear insignificant to an outsider, but each was a deliberate choice, a reclaiming of autonomy in a world designed to erase it. Even in environments designed for total control, the human body remained a site of subtle rebellion. And these acts, while quiet, accumulated into a broader tapestry of defiance that historians now recognize as critical to the survival and morale of entire communities. The psychological impact of these choices was profound. When people exercised control over their own bodies, it was a reminder that, no matter how overwhelming the state's power, they retained a fundamental sense of self. The simple act of deciding when to eat, when to rest, or when to speak, became a form of spiritual resistance. These were acts of reclaiming dignity, affirming that, despite the oppressive schedules and labor demands, the human body remained a vessel of personal freedom. And in that reclamation, even for a moment, lay a source of strength that sustained people through the horrors of war. The tension between state ownership of time and individual ownership of the body also highlights the complexity of resistance. Not every act needed to be monumental to matter. Sometimes, simply standing up when told to bow, refusing to perform a task exactly as ordered, or sneaking a book under a uniform was enough to assert one's humanity. The state could demand attention, enforce attendance, and punish disobedience, but it could not entirely dictate how a person's body felt, moved, or responded internally. That space, though invisible, was sacred, a personal domain immune to totalitarian control. And perhaps most importantly, these acts of bodily ownership reveal something deeply human. Even in the most regimented, violent, and controlled environments, people instinctively fight for autonomy. Where time can be seized and schedules enforced, the body becomes a sanctuary of choice. It is where defiance is intimate, private, and impossible for the state to fully erase. This quiet, persistent resistance, the small gestures of courage, the careful reclamation of bodily agency, reminds us that freedom is not always loud or public. Sometimes, it is a subtle, persistent refusal to be entirely consumed by oppression. While some found ways to resist and reclaim their bodies, for many others, total submission to the state came with a profound cost, one that went far beyond the loss of time or the suppression of personal choice. The human cost of obedience during World War II was staggering, and it was measured not just in numbers or statistics, but in the slow erosion of dignity, health, and psychological stability. When people were forced to live according to schedules dictated entirely by the state, the consequences rippled through every aspect of their lives, leaving scars that, in some cases, lasted a lifetime. Obedience required more than simply following orders. It demanded the internalization of the state's priorities, a willingness to subordinate personal needs, desires, and even relationships to an external agenda. For soldiers on the front lines, the cost was immediate and visible: exhaustion, injury, and constant exposure to danger. But for civilians, the toll was often quieter, less dramatic, yet no less devastating. Daily life was a relentless series of obligations: long work hours, endless drills, rationing, curfews, and constant surveillance. Each task, no matter how small, was a reminder that their time, their energy, and ultimately their lives, were not their own. Physically, this kind of control wore people down. Malnutrition, inadequate rest, and grueling labor became the norm. Factories demanded efficiency at the expense of health, farms required backbreaking work from dawn to dusk. The body was pushed to its limits, often without respite, and the state's expectation was unwavering compliance. Even those who survived physically often carried long-term effects: chronic illness, weakened immune systems, and injuries that never fully healed. The body, which some had tried to reclaim as a site of resistance, could only endure so much before the cost became irreversible. Psychologically, the demands of obedience created a constant, low-level terror. Living under surveillance, knowing that any misstep could lead to punishment, instilled a kind of mental exhaustion that was just as debilitating as physical labor. People learned to suppress curiosity, desire, and even emotion, replacing them with routines dictated by fear and necessity. The result was a generation forced to operate in a state of hypervigilance, where every action was measured against the possibility of reprisal. The constant pressure to conform eroded individuality and fostered a sense of helplessness, leaving deep scars that would persist long after the war ended. This human cost was amplified by the social dynamics of obedience. Families were torn apart, communities monitored, and friendships strained by suspicion. In a society where trust could be dangerous, social bonds were undermined, and isolation became a form of survival. Obedience was not just a personal burden, it reshaped entire social structures. The state demanded conformity not only in behavior but in thought, creating an environment where human connection itself was a liability. Those who resisted were punished, those who complied were drained, and everyone existed in a tense balance between survival and submission. Yet the tragedy of obedience during this period is not only in the suffering it produced but in how invisible that suffering could be to the state itself. To the regime, compliance was success, and the human consequences were often ignored or rationalized. The machinery of control valued efficiency over well-being, labor over life, and submission over health. This makes the stories of resistance all the more remarkable, because every act of defiance was a refusal to accept that cost as inevitable. For those who did comply, the cost was real, tangible, and deeply human, proof that obedience, even when necessary for survival, comes at a price that cannot be measured solely in hours or productivity. And this is what makes the interplay between state control and personal autonomy so haunting. While some could reclaim their bodies and assert agency in small ways, the majority lived under an unrelenting weight of expectation and control. Obedience became a silent suffering, a compromise of the self that could not easily be undone. It reminds us that freedom is not just a matter of absence of oppression, it is also the ability to protect the mind and body from being consumed entirely by forces beyond one's control. In understanding this, we can see that the human cost of obedience is not merely historical, it is a cautionary lens through which to view any system that seeks to dominate time, labor, and life itself. The stories of those who endured, who complied, and who quietly suffered are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but they are also a stark reminder of how heavy the burden of obedience can be. When time is owned by the state, when choices are stripped away, and when survival demands constant compliance, the body and mind bear the weight. And it is in these spaces of quiet suffering that the tension between control and freedom becomes most visible, most profound, and most heartbreakingly human. When we look back at World War II, it's easy to focus on battles, strategies, and the enormous political shifts that reshaped the world. But beneath all of that, there is a subtler story, one about the tension between control and freedom, between the state's attempt to dominate time and the individual's struggle to reclaim their own body. This tension is not just historical, it is deeply symbolic, reflecting a universal conflict between power and humanity. The more the state sought to organize, schedule, and dictate every hour of life, the more personal acts of bodily autonomy became a form of quiet rebellion, a testament to human dignity in the face of overwhelming oppression. Control in its purest form is about removing choice. Totalitarian regimes during the war sought to define every aspect of existence, from labor hours to leisure, from speech to movement. But even when time is fully owned by the state, the body often remains, at least partially, a realm of personal agency. In those moments where people could assert control over how they moved, what they risked, or even what small joys they allowed themselves, they were making a profound statement, that the human spirit cannot be completely subordinated. That body ownership becomes a symbol of resistance, a reminder that freedom is not solely about politics or territory, but about the intimate decisions that define our existence. This symbolism extends beyond individual acts. Consider the ways communities found ways to preserve culture, religion, or simple human rituals under occupation. These were acts that might seem trivial on the surface, singing a song, telling a story, celebrating in secret, but they carried immense significance. They were ways of saying, you can own our schedules, you can dictate our labor, but you cannot fully own who we are. In this context, the body is not just a vessel of survival, it becomes a canvas of identity, an instrument through which human dignity asserts itself against machinery of control. Even on the front lines or in occupied territories, where life was measured in hours of forced labor, marches, or relentless military schedules, small acts of autonomy were deeply symbolic. Choosing when to rest, when to eat secretly, or even when to look away from propaganda was a quiet but powerful way of reclaiming oneself. These gestures may seem minor in isolation, but together they form a larger narrative, that oppression can dominate time, but it cannot entirely dominate the essence of being. This is why stories of resistance, whether subtle or overt, resonate so strongly. They show that freedom can exist in miniature, even when the state claims everything else. The symbolism of control versus freedom also invites us to reflect on the broader psychological and moral dimensions of war. When time is owned by the state and obedience is demanded, people are forced to navigate a complex moral terrain. Every act, even one as simple as deciding whether to comply or to resist in a small way, carries weight. This interplay between external control and internal autonomy highlights the fragility and resilience of human ethics under extreme pressure. The choices made within the boundaries of oppression are what often define history as much as battles or treaties. And this tension has lasting lessons. World War II demonstrates that the human experience cannot be fully quantified or controlled, no matter how total the authority. Systems may dictate schedules, labor, and public behavior, but the inner realm of the body, the decisions about movement, action, and resistance, remain a site of personal sovereignty. It is here, in the subtle assertion of bodily agency, that the essence of freedom is often found. People may be beaten, starved, or forced to march, but the ability to choose, to claim a fraction of autonomy, cannot be entirely erased. In a way, it is both defiance and survival, a reminder that even in the most controlled environments, life finds a way to assert itself. Ultimately, the story of control and freedom in World War II is a human story as much as it is a historical one. The state could own time, dictate schedules, and punish deviation, but the struggle to own one's body, the struggle to assert personal agency in even the smallest acts, reveals the enduring power of the individual. It reminds us that oppression is never total, that the human spirit has a way of pushing back, and that freedom, even when constrained, can manifest in the quietest, most personal ways. That tension, the ownership of time by the state and the ownership of the body by the individual, is not just a historical curiosity, it is a lens through which we understand resilience, resistance, and the profound, often invisible dimensions of human dignity.